Hi, Carl. It's really nice to meet you.
It is great to meet you as well, SJ. I'm so thrilled to be here with you today.
Thank you. So everyone out there, I've just been chatting to Carl Richards and getting to know him a bit because this is a new person for me to talk to as well. So I am going to enjoy getting to know him as I help you get to know him as well. Carl Richards is a podcast strategist. He has a full podcast agency. He has spent 25 years previously in radio and worked in the professional speaking space. So I was just talking to Carl about his learning around speech and speaking at a very young age. Would you like to share that with us all, Carl?
Absolutely. I hated speaking when I was younger. Not that I wasn't good at it. I stuttered horribly when I was a kid. I couldn't get the words out every second or third word. Would stammer and stutter.
Mm,
And to the point where I stopped speaking altogether. And it was those awkward times where, for example, I would be called out in class to read a chapter from a book or a line or not a chapter, a
mm.
paragraph rather, not a whole chapter, but a paragraph from a book. And that was deathly terrifying to have to do that. At the age of 12, I went into speech therapy and spent 2 years there overcoming. I think overcoming might be the wrong word, but being able to navigate and live with my speech impediment.
Mm,
And the biggest thing I learned in those 2 years, and by the way, it was a group of 5 or 6 boys, we're all the same age,
mm,
roughly, all coming in with different types of speech impediments. Some had a recognizable stammer, some people would contort their face completely and couldn't get the words out at all. Anyways, the biggest thing I learned was, and I share this with my clients to this very day, is the only person in control of your speaking is you.
mm.
And the only person in control of your speech is you. And when you know that, that's a very powerful thing to be able to take with you. And all of a sudden, when you know that, the anxiety kind of drips away. Maybe not instantaneously, but as you continue to work through it, it does make the process of speaking, if you can call it a process, a little bit easier when you know that you have that much control.
Mm.
Yeah,
I
it was
I
phenomenal.
I love that because empowerment around voice, which is what I focus
Mm,
on as a voice and performance coach, and the psychological aspect of voice is so much about feeling that you can speak whatever it is that you want to say, that you can share or show up in the way that you want to share or show up and not have the environment control you. So I really appreciate the way that you've framed that.
yeah, it's very important that you are and feel confident that you can show up that way. It was a huge thing to be able to learn that. And then of course of all professions to get into. I'm not the only one, by the way, that's gotten into the media or performing arts. Of all professions to get into, radio. You'd be
Hmm.
surprised the number of people who are in media, television, actors, movie stars, even people who are game show hosts, whatever. A lot of them do have a background in having had a speech impediment and how they've overcome it to their advantage. In some cases, being extremely successful and worldly known. I think you mentioned one that was a
Yes,
surprise to you was James Earl Jones.
James
Yeah.
L. Jones, and I only found that out yesterday because I was talking to my partner about this upcoming interview with you, and he said, "Oh, I think that James L. Jones had this occur." My partner's also has a background in acting and has focused a lot
Mhm.
on speech, and so he said, "I think that perhaps it's to do with having to focus on speaking with such consciousness
Yeah.
actually brings about an excellence that may seem unreachable in the beginning."
I think so, and I think certainly in the performance arts world too, when you're stepping into another character, that's not you.
Right.
That's different.
Absolutely.
So stepping into a
Yeah.
Shakespearean role, or even some of the actors of the one that comes to mind is River Phoenix, great actor,
Hmm.
but put him in an interview setting. And he was absolutely terrified to be. You could see it in his face almost when he was being interviewed. the terror in his eyes. He hated it. He completely hated it. But then on top of that, speaking of the performing arts, a lot of people who are, in my experience, anyways, who have speech impediments, in part of managing it, they've they almost create a bit of animation with their voice. I do it because I spent years in radio. But one of the things that we know to be true is that if you sing, you don't
Mm,
stutter.
mm,
You don't
right.
stutter when you sing. You don't stammer when you sing, because there's a certain mathematics or rhythm to it. There's a science to it, and it's very different from just free flowing conversation like we're doing right now. So for years, I could sing in a church choir, no problem. Put me in front of an audience to speak, even at the front of church, reading a passage from the Bible, that would completely mess that up. But when you focus on other aspects of the speech and your voice, and note the animation in it, sometimes that's a saving grace, because you're focusing on other aspects of your speaking as opposed to the speaking itself, if that makes
Hmm.
sense.
Oh, that's wonderful. You've brought up so many things that are close to my heart. And one of them, which is very rarely understood by people outside of the acting profession, is how many introverts, or rather, how many actors are introverts, myself included, though obviously I like showing up for distinct moments as myself. But it was
Mm,
harder to learn to show up as I do on YouTube and in these other formats as myself initially.
right.
And I was used to being able to hide behind the mask of character.
Right.
And I'm currently just doing a little reaction video because it was requested by some subscribers on Helena Bonham Carter, who I wouldn't have particularly focused on by myself, but it's been very interesting watching how shy she is.
Mhm.
And it's clear to me that she did not go into acting to be noticed as a person in the sense
Yeah.
of seeking fame and wanting to be in the public eye. Rather, it was more about being able to express herself through these different lenses behind which, to some extent, you can hide, even while you're also revealing. It's just that the audience doesn't know what you're revealing about yourself through that character.
That's a very interesting point that you make there too, because that's the second nugget that I'll usually share with clients for speaking and with podcasting as well, is the audience doesn't know what you don't tell them. So if you're showing, it sounds glaringly
Yeah.
obvious, but the
Right.
audience doesn't know. So if you're showing up as a specific character and you're not giving everything about your character, everything about you away, audience doesn't know that. They just see you in that space. So those two things together, the only person in control of your speech or your speaking is you, and the audience doesn't know what you don't tell them, are two great things that. And of course there's other aspects of, voice inflection and making sure you're using your voice and the power of your voice and to your benefit. But those two little nuggets alone can really save you a lot of anguish of, you know dealing with the confidence side of speaking, because you can have a beautiful voice, but if you're not confident with it, if you're a bundle of nerves when you're in front of an audience, be it on camera or be it in front of on a live stage, all the great voice exercises in the world might not save you if you're dealing with the pasties in that moment. You know what I mean? Where you
Yes.
just cannot speak because you're so dry throat, dry mouth.
Yes.
Just somebody give me a bottle of water to
Yes.
solve this. So, but yeah, yeah, those two things alone, I think, can really help with the mental exercises, I guess we can say.
Yes, absolutely. And I noticed your accent there. I just, because we spoke about that earlier, this is a complete subject change, but because
Uh,
on this podcast, I'm not only focusing on people from all professions, I'm also focusing on the wonderful variety of accent and voice out there.
yes.
So Carl Richards is in Ontario, Canada, and is Canadian. And I just heard that, and it was a pleasure. I love the different sounds that people show up with.
She heard my Canadian accent,
I
eh?
did. I did. I did indeed on some of those key wonderful
Oh
vowels.
gosh.
So I wanted also to leap into some of the things that I ask everyone.
Sure.
And the first question, leading from the more challenging to the more positive, is
Yeah.
if you can share your most or a most disempowered experience with voice or speaking?
Disempowered experience. Oh my goodness. I think the biggest one that actually was probably one of the catalysts that got me into speech therapy was standing in front. I've already alluded to it a little bit, but standing in front of the church when I was 12 years old. For some reason, I'd put my hand up and said, I'll volunteer to read a passage from the Bible. I don't know why I thought that was a good idea when I was 12, but maybe I thought I could have that, doing that would help me
Divine intervention.
divine it. There you go. Divine it. I like that. I don't think that's exactly what I was thinking when I was 12, but I started to stammer partway through this passage and I couldn't finish it. And I was just pouring in sweat and, under the arms was just dripping, like just this complete, utter terror.
Mm.
And it wasn't until the minister came and put his hand on my shoulder and was looking over my shoulder and helped me to finish reading the passage by speaking it with me that I was able to complete that. So that was probably the most disempowering moment that I had, but it also was the catalyst that put me into speech therapy that changed my life completely.
That was possibly the divine part because you don't know why you stood up and maybe you needed help and you needed to
I don't know
know that you
why.
needed help. I like
Yep.
making these interpretations.
Yep.
Thank you. I think that's very relatable, even for people
Mhm.
who may not have had a stammer,
Mhm.
but are speaking English as a second language. So many of my clients, most, in fact, of my clients, speak English as a second language very well.
Right.
But sometimes it's those early experiences coming to the US usually and
Hmm.
standing with a class and having to learn the language and standing up to speak, and they feel so alone. And that's carried with them, even though to my ears, they speak very good English. It's still in them. And that's what needs to be almost updated because those early experiences, if they're not worked through, can really stay with us in speaking. That early experience led you to do all this work. And so it wasn't holding you back ultimately. But when we're not aware of what's holding us back and we haven't delved into it yet, it keeps holding us back.
True. So true. And English, to somebody where English is not their first language, English is a tough language if it's not your first.
When it comes to spellings and
Mhm.
all the irregularities and the lack of rules, and that's because English is a language made up of so many others due to the British Isles having been invaded so many times early on and so many different languages
Right.
being spoken, which makes it very rich, but very difficult.
Yes.
So I would like to move on to
Mhm.
a most empowered experience with voice.
Oh goodness. Whew. You figure that one would be easier.
Well, maybe there were
come,
so
come
many.
up with one. There have been several, but I think the most empowering with voice was, oh my goodness. I'll cite one. It was several years ago, 2007 actually. I had joined the Toastmasters organization, and I didn't know that public speaking would be something that I'd gravitate to. Yes, I was in radio. Yes, I loved being, the guy behind the microphone, but I didn't think that standing on a stage and speaking inspirationally or having a message was something that I would gravitate to. But it was. And in 2007 was the first time I competed in the Toastmasters organization. And there, at that time, there were 6 different levels of competition, all the way from your local club right up to the international speaking competition. And I got to level 4. And at level 4, I ended up coming in 3rd place. But here's the kicker to the most empowered feeling with voice. I came in 3rd place with my message, my speech, to 2 other people who had been on that stage, been on the international stage, right? So being to the 6th level, just hadn't completed, just hadn't been able to win that coveted international speech title. So I'm standing as the 3rd place finisher with who I would consider to be 2 other almost champions. That made me feel really good knowing that I was, even though I landed 3rd, because some people say, gold is better than bronze, but think
It
about who I'm competing
depends.
with. I'm
Right.
competing with two people and I'm placing with two people who've already been there, done that, just haven't won the coveted award yet.
That's
That made me
wonderful.
feel really good.
May
Yeah,
I ask what the speech was about?
absolutely. I this was also another empowering moment. I came out on stage
Oh my
in
gosh.
front of my Toastmasters organization, where, and again, it's nothing new to our world, but certainly at that time, I still had a lot of fear
Mm,
about who's going to know, how am I going to be
mm.
judged, how's the organization locally going to look at me. So, but anyways, I think that was part of the power, was that message and
Right.
how that message resonated with them.
Well, and that's completely about the empowered voice. And
Absolutely.
I think to have empowered voice doesn't mean we feel fine about it and we have no fear. It can
Mhm.
even, it's usually when we do that first thing for the first time that feels frightening, whatever that is, that's a really, really good example. I'm so glad you
Mhm.
shared that.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was scary in the moment, I think, at each level, because every time I'm
Every
speaking
time you had to keep
I'm it's like I'm coming out
all
every
over
time I'm
again.
speaking. And it's funny because the actual speech itself was about coming out to my parents.
Hmm.
So it was coming out, coming out, coming out, coming out.
So it's very meta. You're
It
doing
very
it there,
was.
you're talking about doing it, having done
And that
it.
and then came in third. Came out and then came in third. It was good. It was worked out.
It's fabulous. Oh, that's so great. So my next question is, whose voice do you particularly like?
Other than mine.
Other than yours, that's a given. I know, I'm there too.
Well, it's funny because so many people hate their voice, right? They hate their
Hmm.
own voice when they hear it for the first time. In the recording and working with a lot of podcasters, I get this. Oh, I hate the sound of my voice. Well, get used to it because that's what it sounds like. But I would say a voice that I really, really love is a guy by the name of Mike Lipkin.
Okay.
And he's Canadian, but he's lived in many different countries. I believe South Africa was one of them. So he has a very unique sounding voice. He also used to stutter. You would not know to hear him speak that he stuttered, that he did stutter. Because sometimes, even though I've stuttered, I still will slip into a stammer or a stutter. But he has a very unique warmth and resonance to his voice and a very unique articulation, given the different countries and different dialects of English, plus I don't know how many other languages he can speak that he has had to embrace. But he has a very unique sounding voice and he has a way of drawing out or drawing you in, I guess, by
Hmm.
using his voice. Very powerful.
Oh, I'm going to look him up when we're finished. I can't wait to hear.
Definitely do that. He's just you hear his voice and you're like, wow.
One of the things that I love exploring is the combination of accent that
Mm-hmm,
individuals can have. Having lived in
mm-hmm,
different countries myself and having different influences and noticing that my eldest son has a slightly different accent from my youngest son because their dad's from Guatemala and we live in Oakland, and it's kind of has to do with how they've interpreted their identity as well.
sure.
So that's something that I love listening to, is the varied
Mm-hmm.
accent. And then my final question is asking you to ask me any question you would like,
Oh
because I
my
feel like I
goodness.
need to be on the spot too. But now you may feel on the spot coming up with
Oh
it.
my goodness. Well, one of the questions I tend to ask a lot of people is, "Do you have a podcast?" That's a glaringly obvious answer, but no, seriously, I think a question I'd like to ask you is how how has the power of your voice impacted your life overall?
Oh my gosh,
Ooh.
that's a really good one. And one thing that I expect to do in this podcast moment is also share what comes up for me when I'm asked the question.
Mm,
It's meant to make me vulnerable. So I immediately think when I'm asked about something like that, oh gosh, that's so relevant. And how am I going to share this appropriately? Because it touches on very personal aspects of my life. And then I usually
Mhm.
think about other people. So, say it was just me, I'd probably share without question. So, I have to take a moment to think about how to answer that honestly and then be appropriate. And I have to figure out what's appropriate in the moment.
Okay,
So that's
fair.
what comes up for me. It's very liberating sharing that, actually. I was in, I will be quite personal. I was in a very difficult marriage for 17 years until about 6 years ago. And it was a challenge to show up with voice all the time. I think that having had a strong foundational training in the physical voice at RADA, where I trained, made it very clear for me when my physical voice was blocked and how that relates to the psychological voice.
Hmm.
So, throughout the entire process, there were times of me observing my emotional experience. And this could be a litmus for me or a signal to me this is not a good situation. And working to get out of that situation. When you have children, there's always a whole lot of complexity for everybody. It still can often be particularly true for women
Hmm.
about how to release yourself from a difficult situation and what's best for everyone else. So I was always conscious of voice. And I think that's because of my training. And I had moved away from acting, not fully. Last I acted was right before the pandemic. But I had started to emphasize playwriting because it felt like it was a way to express my voice instead of just doing the words of others. So there was this whole process around voice that came from my training. So although I knew how to have a released physical voice, that actually showed me where psychologically I was shut down and how I would actually feel. I would feel a lot of tightness or emotion comes up, and I still sometimes emotion comes up. I feel my throat closing up. So you don't become a perfect, we're not meant to be perfect, I think. We become a person striving with the tools you have and then continuing to develop your tools and noticing things you wouldn't have noticed otherwise. So that entire journey also included me being a stucco contractor because it supported my husband's business, or I created a business with him to support our
Right.
family. A world that I'm an artist. How did I ever get there? But I learned to use my voice in all kinds of ways in that very male dominated sphere and learned skills that allow me to be a good business owner now. So, voice is ongoing, and it's something also that I constantly talk to my kids about. So it's a whole, you can see that I could sort of go on and on and on and all the layers. So I really appreciate your asking me that question and helping me to be more personal.
Very articulate. It was a. I knew it was a not an easy question to answer, but I think one of the things that you touched on is there are so many different layers, and I think that there are times when we either feel we have to be silent, or we don't have a voice, or we have different parts of, or we have different voices that we use when we're in different situations, when we're talking to our kids, when we're with our husband, when we're sad, when we're happy, we're all of those things. So thank you for telling that personal story and putting yourself on the hot seat.
Thank you, Carl. I really appreciate your helping me to do what I'm always asking people to do. That's what I want. That's why I want that question. Thank you so much.
Awesome.
So I will share all your details with everyone in just a moment so that they can find you and know where to find you. And I want to thank you so much for meeting with us today.
Thank you. It's been a blast.